The future of energy will be a world where we have much more energy services delivered to us as a global population relative to the amount of energy supply we put in, because it will be more efficient. We will use more sources of efficient energy and use less, relatively speaking, of both inefficient and more polluting sources of energy. So we're on our way there. This is a globally, massively challenging and collective problem that requires collectively smart solutions.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome back to the Future of Energy on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Eirik Wærness, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor. We'll be discussing Equinor's recently published Energy Perspectives for 2024 and how whether we build walls or bridges will decide our energy future. Hello, Eirik. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here, and it's a perfect time to be talking with you. You just published the 2024 edition of your Energy Perspectives at Equinor. And I know, from my own personal experience, a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of thought goes into this type of piece and this type of analysis. So I just wanted to start off by asking, why do you do it?
Well, why we end up publishing publishing the work is a separate question, but I guess we do it because we have to, in a sense. I mean, it's as part of our role. Part of my job is to be responsible for our forecast for the relevant energy markets where Equinor is participating, whether we're talking about oil or oil products or gas or power. So we have to make up our mind about where the global energy markets are going. And then this is a way of, first of all, documenting that work and writing about it. And then for the company, it's important to also present its view externally, participate in the debate. Equinor is a very large international energy company based in a very small country like Norway, and it would be strange if a company like ours didn't participate in the debate, offer our views, get some criticism, get some traction on it. So that's also why we do it, right? And then over the last years, since the Paris Agreement, I guess in 2015, also thinking about possible scenarios where the world might go if energy and climate policies develop differently and so on is also part of the reasoning behind putting this out in the public sphere.
Well, we're glad you do it. We're glad you share it, and we're glad you're here with us to discuss it. And as you said, in your energy perspectives, you provide both a short-term and a long-term outlook. And I wanted to start with the short-term. And I'm curious, what do you see as the major influences that will shape the energy markets over the next few years and determine where we may be going?
Yeah, in the short term, you typically have a very strong impact directly from the things that drive economic development, economic growth. If you're surprised either on a higher economic growth or on a lower economic growth, you're going to get the same type of surprising impact with slightly less impact in the key energy markets. Our energy markets are more or less completely dominated by fossil fuels still. More than 75% of our energy use is fossil. That won't change over the next couple of years, no matter what happens. So it is about economic development. Everybody's looking at China as the biggest growth engine, as it has been, because it's also now become a large economy. Highest growth rate among the large economies is now seen in India. That growth comes with growth in key energy demand components. Oil and gas demand will continue to grow. We think we see the peak of coal demand now. We were surprised by coal demand growing more last year than we thought. So that's an update. As a consequence, the CO2 emissions continued to grow more than we thought last year. But we now see that the CO2 emissions hopefully will flatten out and then even decline towards the end of this decade. The key to that will be China. Geopolitical events will, of course, then possibly have sudden impacts on not on energy demand, but on energy supply. We saw that in the path up towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine during the fall of 2021, where gas volumes coming into Europe suddenly started to decline. And then, of course, it was full stop afterwards. And then everybody has to scramble to find other sources because energy demand is still there. And if energy demand stays and supply is lower, you're going to have a massive increase in prices, which we had. We all hope that the current new war in the Middle East doesn't spread too far away from where it is now. We hope that it stops anytime soon. It should. But if it doesn't, that it doesn't spread and involve increasing conflicts around the Persian Gulf, even more serious conflict in the Red Sea, because that would then also lead to impacts for global oil and gas supply coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. So security of supply concerns, then also more geopolitical conflict, more in general, protectionist, populist type of decisions could short-term not affect a lot, but long-term can be a long-term driver for energy demand. We're all waiting for the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States to make a dent on anything. But these trends, the things that have to happen in such a large system generally are very long-term in nature.
I wanted to go back for a second. You mentioned that you see the peaking potentially of coal demand and carbon emissions over the next few years. And I'm wondering what's driving that, because that would be, kind of really the first fossil fuel to see peak. And it's good news to hear carbon emissions potentially peaking in the next few years.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely good news, but of course it comes with a caveat, because one of the reasons why we see it peaking is a relatively moderate economic growth, which then leads to slower energy demand growth, in particular in the emerging economies outside of China. In that part of the world, which is the largest part of the world, CO2 emissions will continue to grow, and they will grow faster if economic growth is higher there. In the industrialized world, the part of the world where you and I are living, emissions have been falling for a long time, and that will continue. And with lower growth here as well, that fall can be slightly faster. So and then the point about China is important, because they're the biggest emitter. They also have very significant ambitions in terms of actually peaking their own CO2 emissions by 2030. We think they might deliver on that, and even before 2030. And then it's the combination of those three drivers: growing emissions in the emerging economies, lower emissions in the industrialized world, and possibly relatively stable emissions in China, maybe a little bit of a decline, that in total leads to that decline. If we had been more optimistic about GDP growth over the next years, we would probably have to be less optimistic, if you like, on the possibilities of peaking CO2 demand in the CO2 emissions in the energy sector.
And I think that's a great time to move to the long-term outlook, because you do provide a long-term outlook to 2050 under two different scenarios, one that you call walls and the other bridges. And I'll come back to those. But first, I wanted to ask you how you think about using and communicating these types of scenarios broadly with the public. And I ask because, the International Energy Agency in recent years has, in my opinion, created a lot of confusion by often blurring the distinctions between its forecasts and its net zero roadmap, by blurring the distinctions between what it expects will happen and what needs to happen to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius ambitions of the Paris Agreement. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think about communicating this distinction between what you expect will happen and what needs to happen in your own work, and how each type of analysis should be used?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think, first of all, when we use the concept of scenarios, it's all stories about the future. And those stories depend then on your assumptions, and they depend also on the methods you use when you make them. How do you make the numbers come together? So we try to distinguish. So our two scenarios are very different in the sense they're very similar in the sense that they're both very uncertain. If you take all the the point estimates and all the values and all the data at face value, they're really uncertain. But they're very different in terms of how we make them. So what the scenario that we call walls, which is our forecasting scenario, the one that we think has the highest likelihood, if you like, that's a forecast. So that's where we start out today. We make our assumptions about what we think will continue in terms of energy and climate policies. Where do we see energy and climate policies tightening? How do we see technology developing? How do we see economic growth affecting consumption patterns and therefore energy demand? What's the car density going to be in India by 2045 when they have reached income levels that parts of Europe had 10 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a forecasting scenario. And then the results in terms of ending oil demand, gas demand, CO2 emission level from the energy sector in 2050 is what it is. So that is what we call in an analytical term of the word, that's the positive type of scenario. It's a positive description. And we are very clear when we say our Bridges scenario, that is a 1.5 degree consistent scenario, and it has been made to be a 1.5 degree consistent scenario. It's a scenario which is really is based on an enormously strict assumption that we have to stay below the 450 ppm carbon concentration in the atmosphere all the way out until 2050 and then beyond. So that means that we're never supposed to exceed the 1.5 degree limit. Of course, with all the uncertainties around a link between CO2 concentration and temperature, but that's another story. And then what we do with that scenario is that we backcast. So we start out with, what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to be net negative in terms of CO2 emissions in 2050 because we think we still will have some fossil fuels that we burn. So there will be some positive emissions. And then we have to compensate by taking enough carbon out of the atmosphere so that we actually end up at being net negative. And we look at that on this 450 ppm trajectory. And then we calculate our way back. So that's a backcasting scenario. And we try to make that distinction clear. And it's a normative scenario. This is, what has to happen. It's what we would like to happen in many ways if we, by some magic, were able to construct a world that, according to this scenario, we have roughly the same GDP in 2050 as we have in the other scenario. And we've reached, we've stayed at the 450 ppm, we've become net negative, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you talk about it very, very often, you tend to forget that you should use, instead of saying will, you should say would. And you said should instead of shall. And that's where we often miss out, I think, in both in public debate and when we get used to talking about these. I guess in our case also, we have the benefit that we have different economic growth rates, for instance, between these two scenarios. So we can assume that the development towards a net zero alternative will have different impact on GDP growth for a period. And then we can allow different things to happen. We introduce climate costs, which are more important in the non-1.5 degree consistent scenario than in the 1.5 degree consistent scenario. I think in the case of the IEA, without judging them, one of the dangers for them is that the only difference between the scenarios there is policy. They have the same type of GDP growth rates, et cetera, et cetera. So then it's policy and resulting technology development, if you like, that leads to the net zero world relative to their stated policy scenario, their accelerated transition scenario, and so on. So, but it is about, when we talk about it, we should really be careful in terms of distinguishing between a positive description of the world as it could be and a normative description about a world as it should be.
Yeah, and I noticed in both your walls and bridges scenarios, you point out the importance of the energy trilemma in thinking about the future of energy. That there's an inherent tension between our need to decarbonize our energy system while also maintaining energy affordability and energy security. And I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the biggest source of tension to obtaining all three, having decarbonization, affordable, and secure energy? And how does this shape your thinking about what our future energy mix and future energy system will look like?
I guess to start with, I think what we've done over the last year is sort of bringing forward the energy trilemma discussion as a base for where we think the world might go in terms of energy market and energy system development. That was putting together things that were obvious in other parts of the world, maybe not so much in Brussels or in Europe after 2015, because we tended to talk about the energy system only under the variable of the need to decarbonize. And we even equated decarbonization with sustainable. And we thought about that dimension of the energy trilemma as being the sustainable part, and then we have something else. In other parts of the world, it has been for a very long time very obvious that another important part of energy is that it's affordable, because it isn't for very large parts of population in the world. And it has to be secure. It has to be reliable, because it isn't. Every time in poor parts of the world, every time the sun sets and you need the electricity system is not able to deliver that, right? So, and then with the increased tension, the geopolitical conflicts, and ultimately the war with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, it became very obvious also for the main political actors in Brussels that there's a dimension here called security of supply. And when the gas prices and consequently the electricity prices came up, it also became really visible for Europe that affordability of energy is an important driver. And then, since it is a trilemma, we cannot obtain all these three dimensions to the full anytime soon, and maybe never. It can't be solved, right? It's like a dilemma that can't be solved. This is a three-dimensional dilemma. So it has to be balanced. And things you choose, if you go too far away on one of these axes, at least for periods, you risk going too far away from the other concerns, right? So a sustainable energy policy will probably have to balance this and be somewhere in between, at least for periods. That means that we might have to prioritize affordability for a while, maybe at the expense of faster decarbonization. Since we don't have affordable solutions for this combined with decarbonization yet. We might get better at it. Same thing with security of supply. If you want to replace Russian gas with offshore wind in Europe, it doesn't solve the security of supply problem when it doesn't blow. You can add other types of balancing. You can either add backup, so you have some other power sources, or you can have batteries or types of electricity storage. Well, but that makes it twice as expensive. So then you ruin the affordability dimension. And it is in that balance, together with a lot of other concerns. Technology development might help us on all these three dimensions, right? But for periods, so that needs, it's investments. This is about research. This is about deploying technology and ultimately about scaling it as well. There's a lot of good solutions out there. They're just too small to make an impact yet. So it is in that discussion that I think, and especially when we talk about affordability of energy, one of the paradoxes of what happened in 2022 on the gas side was, of course, that in order to dampen the price impacts of the energy crisis in Europe scrambled to bring all free LNG, so liquefied natural gas, in vessels around the world, to buy that in and bring it into Europe to improve the balance of the European gas market and lower prices, lower electricity prices, lower gas prices, to make energy more affordable for the poorest European consumer. The problem is that the poorest European consumer is not very poor in a global scale, right? So that LNG would otherwise have gone to countries that are much poorer, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, who couldn't afford to compete. They then had a security of supply problem that increased. They started using more coal. They used coal-fired electricity to a larger extent than they otherwise would have, and global CO2 emissions went up. So by improving the affordability challenge in Europe, we actually worsened the decarbonization challenge globally at the margin. So that's how this has to play out and will play out, we think, going forward.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig into how you think these various tensions and the need to balance them is going to play out going forward. And I wanted to dig into the scenarios that you lay out in your energy perspectives. For our listeners who haven't had an opportunity to read the report yet, as I said, you examine two scenarios, which you call walls and bridges. I believe that's inspired by a quote attributed to Sir Isaac Newton, that we build too many walls and not enough bridges. That is, we build too many barriers to change and not enough bridges to overcome them. And in your energy perspectives, the walls scenario, as you mentioned, is more of a forecast and captures the relatively slow, incremental pace of change that you believe characterizes the energy transition today, while the bridges scenario, as you said, is more normative and captures the radical and fast changes that would be needed to move the world onto a path aligned with the 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition of the Paris Agreement. You noted in your report that while the wall scenario is not a business as usual scenario, it is consistent with the pace of change we're making today. So I wanted to ask you, how would you characterize the pace of change today and the progress that we are making on this energy transition?
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, that if the 1.5 degree target, given that that's the ambition, the pace of change today is much too slow. We're talking about slow baby steps relative to what is needed. But what we can see is an energy transition that is, you can see it's building up, is lurking in the background. So far in human history, we've only had energy additions. Every time we find a new source of energy and we find out how to use it, we add it on to the existing sources of energy. And that's where we are today. We use more biomass now than ever in human history. We use more coal than we did in the coal age. We use more oil than we did in the oil age. We add them on. And now we see the contours of new renewables, primarily solar and wind electricity, being added up on top of the other sources of energy. But we do see technological changes that relatively soon will speed up and make it possible for us to see, first of all, not an addition anymore, so that primary energy demand and even final energy consumption might flatten out. And then also a transition where we start replacing existing energy sources, primarily the fossil fuel sources, with renewables, and then have a speeding up. So we do, for in the world scenario, when we pass 2030, we think we start to break the link between growth in energy emissions, energy-related emissions, that will come down, and even primary energy demand might come down. We're going to see a peak in coal use, maybe this year, oil by 2030, and therefore thereafter a relatively moderate decline, and a gas demand that flattens out and becomes a plateau in the mid-30s. And that's really a big change compared to what we've seen. So in that sense, it's an acceleration. You know, where the best signals of this is of course on things like what has happened to lighting. It's massive. What is happening to solar panel is pretty big, and then the EV revolution as we see it, at least brewing. We see it in Norway, but that doesn't matter for the world. But we actually see it happening gradually in China. If we can deliver enough batteries, if there will be enough charging points for consumers, that could really make a dent into emissions from the road transport sector. But there's 45 other technologies that we have to significantly speed up as well to deliver this, whether we're talking about manufacturing processes or heating or whatever. And that's where the change is too slow.
And with the change being too slow, but change being made, I'm curious, relative to the 1.5 degree temperature rise that you target and backcast to in the bridges scenario, what kind of temperature rise do you see? And do you see temperatures continuing to rise throughout 2050 in the wall scenario?
Yeah, the wall scenario, if we try to extrapolate what's happening there and we model it beyond 2050, or at least we look at what this probably would be going towards 2100. As long as there's positive CO2 emissions, the carbon concentration goes up, so the temperature will continue to increase. We will reach net zero in that scenario as well, probably around 2075. So what we see is that according to the IPCC figures, this is roughly consistent with a 2.2 degree warming. That is much more optimistic than we thought some years back. So things are changing, and they're changing faster. Economic growth is slightly lower too. That's not necessarily only good news, but at least it helps on energy demand growth and CO2 emissions as well. So it sounds bleak when you compare it to bridges, because it's a geopolitical conflict-prone scenario as well, right? But actually, in terms of emissions and energy transition, it's a pretty good result compared to what we thought some few years back.
And I wanted to turn to the bridges scenario, because when you characterize the pace of change in your two scenarios, you write that the energy transition is significant in walls, and getting to a peak in carbon emissions and a 2.2 degree rise is significant. But the energy transition is radical, I believe in your words, in bridges. So I wanted to ask you, how radical is radical? What does radical look like? And what does the energy mix look like in that scenario?
Yeah, well, I guess radical depends on the point of where you're standing. But if you look at things like, first of all, the starting point is that we have a global economy that by 2050 is almost twice as large as it is today, both in bridges and walls. We have 2 billion more people. That means that per capita income might have grown by 50%, per capita purchasing power. And then we think we can run, in the bridges case, if we think it is possible, but what we have to do is then we have to run that economy using only 25% of the oil we use today. So we go from 100 million barrels to 25 roughly. We reduce gas demand rapidly after 2030 as well. So we use maybe 25 to 30% of the gas we use today. We produce 2.5 times more electricity. So the increase in electricity generation is 140 some percent. And that is completely decarbonized. Today, electricity generation in the world is 40% coal. and 20% gas. In the world's case, we think we will need, or we will have, about 1 billion tons of CO2 taken out of the atmosphere via carbon capture and storage. Well, in the British case, we need 6 times more. 6 billion tons, and that's direct air capture. It's using natural carbon sinks, it's bioenergy with CCS, and of course more, even more. So the total road transport in the world, in the British case, is basically fully electric. We do have a little bit of hydrogen there, probably for long distance trucking. And this includes the long haul trucking across the United States. Has to be hydrogen or electric. That the energy use in that sector is 40% of what it is today. So if that's not radical, what is?
Absolutely. And I want to ask you, if you kind of take a step back and summarize, how wide is the gap between the walls and bridges scenarios, between what we're on course to do and what we need to do to meet our Paris Agreement goals, both in terms of the gap in terms of what we need to be doing and the gap in the outcomes? Both, you mentioned climate, but also the economy and the energy mix that we'd be using.
Yeah, I think, in terms of gap, I mentioned 25 million barrels per day of oil demand in the Bridges case. In the Walls case, we're at 80. So we go down 20% compared to what we are today, as an example. In the Walls case, we increase electricity generation globally by 75%. And then in the British case, it's almost 75% more. It's up to 150% increase. So the gap in result is massive. And even though the temperature difference is 2.2 versus 1.5 degrees, right? If we use those measures. And it is not as if Bridges requires something completely different. It's just that it requires much more of the same. So it's more renewables. It's slightly more nuclear energy as well. It's massive improvements in energy efficiency compared to what we see in Walls, which also improves energy efficiency significantly. And that has to be done then by massively different policies. How do you incentivize energy efficiency is really difficult. It's something we talk about every time we have a chance. When you get something that improves the energy efficiency in your home, a new refrigerator or a heat pump, electric heat pump, electricity becomes so cheap that you tend to use more of it. So you keep your house cooler than it otherwise would have in the summer, and you keep it warmer in January than it otherwise would have. You tend to buy a slightly larger refrigerator if you can, because the energy use is lower. So the Jevons paradox effect is also very difficult. So we need incentives. We need a complete overhaul of global electricity market design to make it possible to believe that you can produce power profitably once you've invested in it, whether that's a gas-fired power plant that only will run 800 hours a year, 1/10 of the year, because you need that to balance the systems, or if you produce offshore wind, you know that when the wind blows, there's a lot of other wind producers that produces, and the price tends to be very low. So how do I make money on sort of that marginal offshore wind park? So there's also a massive change in policies, a mix between carrot and sticks. How do we get American consumers to stop buying 3.5-ton trucks, even if they run on batteries, because it's so resource intensive, right? How do we reduce the resource intensity of our overall consumption because we need to allow for room for 4 billion new middle class consumers that also want to buy stuff.
You mentioned policies that are needed. There's been a lot of focus over the past year on things like the Inflation Reduction Act policies in the United States, the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. And do we need to see more of the same in terms of those types of policies, or do you think we need to see a different type of policy that we may not be seeing yet be put forth by countries?
Yeah, we need more of that, and we might need also different types of policies. But I think to some extent, the combination of the EU tradition of putting a price on carbon and the American tradition of subsidizing the reduction in the use of carbon, or to subsidize production or developing energy sources that do not emit carbon, a combination of that would be really good, right? So ideally, you guys in the States, you should prepare for a higher price of gasoline at the pump through a carbon tax. And ideally, Europe should see larger tax credits or subsidies for developing alternatives to fossil fuels. Carbon border adjustment mechanism is one tool to try and incentivize countries that we otherwise don't agree with to introduce carrot and sticks in the energy transition. And therefore, I think as an economist, I believe that is a pretty good measure. It's really difficult, but it is a good political measure to expand the club of regimes or countries or areas that put a price on carbon. But of course, it will be looked upon, especially now, it will be looked upon as a sort of as a trade war tool at the margin, and therefore difficult. We are in a protectionist period. We want to re-globalize and homeshore, nearshore production because we don't trust each other. It increases the cost of trade, but it is probably necessary with those types of measures. I think that the one thing that we don't talk enough about is how do we make a just transition in the emerging economies where we have to finance part of that from the rich parts of the world, either by transfers of money, transfers of technology, or for paying up for the good technologies that are developed in the emerging economies, making sure that we pay properly for that, and paying properly for the products in the third world so that they get increased possibilities to participate in economic development, and at the same time allow for energy transition there as well. We're talking about a billion people or close to a billion people without access to electricity, 2-3 billion people without access to clean cooking facilities. And how do we do that without increasing emissions? How do we make sure that happens?
And the need for people in developing countries to continue to be able to improve their own way of life, have access to affordable energy for their own needs, the way we're accustomed to in the United States and Europe and the rest of the developed world, it kind of raises the other important question of there often seem to be two main pathways when we talk about decarbonization, either rapid degrowth, kind of taking down economic activity, and you talked about the potential to break that link, but there's either rapid degrowth or rapid electrification, and then powering that electrification. Are those our only two choices? And is degrowth, particularly when you look at the needs of the global south, is that even an option?
In the simple sense of the word, no. And in terms of degrowth, well, I think underlying both those two alternatives, I guess what is really needed is what decouples growth from use of energy, and that's energy efficiency improvements. And the paradox today is that the emerging economies, they are 3 times less energy efficient than we are in the West. So they use 3 times more energy per dollar of income than we do in the West. So a 7% annual growth in India is associated with a much higher growth in energy demand than a 7% increase in growth if we were to be able to make that happen in the West. And it's in there that electricity comes in. Electrification is massively important because the end user efficiency of electricity is fantastic. We don't waste a lot of heat. So it's a really efficient source of final energy but then we have to produce it, of course, efficiently and with as little carbon when we generate it as possible as well. So and I think that also what we should think through, degrowth sounds smart or sounds like a good idea when you look at the sort of the resource waste, how rich we are in the West, how many times we travel by planes. But degrowth at a global scale sounds like a very bad idea to me. There are a lot of aspects of growth that is not only associated with energy, but it's also about providing jobs. It's about providing education. It's about meaningful lives, and it's about also handling our ability to handle negative things that come our way that we cannot plan. If you're hit by a big flood, you're in a much better position to handle that if you are at a relatively high level of income compared to if you're really poor, as an example. So that is when you talk about we should put that context into central parts of Africa and think about what would degrowth mean here. How do we do that?
Right. And if the alternative to degrowth is electrification, of course, electrification is a means, not an end. It matters how the electricity is generated in terms of its ability to help us decarbonize. And we need to generate it from low carbon sources. And I wanted to ask you, where are we in supplying the renewable power and the natural gas needed for a lower carbon electricity supply than we have today?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of good news on that side. I mean, the growth that we've seen in solar, and in particular solar, but also wind over the last decade is boding well, if you like, for those technologies to take a very large part of the growth in electricity, with some cost challenges over the last years, in particular in the wind part of that. Solar seems to have come over that. Gas is a fantastic way of replacing coal quickly. Just look at the United States. I mean, the reason why the United States is doing so well on its carbon emissions is because of the shale gas revolution and the ability to replace gas or put gas into the electricity system and take out coal. And it was caused by the fact that you had gas, not by policies, in the beginning at least. So the story there is good. If you want to go all the way to zero, of course, then at some point you will have to decarbonize the use of gas in the power sector as well with CCS. So far, growth in renewable electricity takes place mainly in areas where we do have a well-functioning electricity system, where you can replace sources of electricity. In the beginning, it was, Western Europe, to some extent North America. Now it is in China, but China is also very well electrified. We don't see yet how we can do this with running full-scale electricity system based only on intermittent renewables. So the development of batteries, the development of seasonal storage is probably going to be the biggest challenge, because such a large part of the population in the world live north of the 40th parallel, and that's a pretty dark place during January, and cold place and quiet place sometimes. So that type of electricity system with very large contents of intermittent electricity is something that we struggle to develop yet. We believe it's going to come, but it doesn't come fast enough.
And there are other sectors where we struggle to electrify them, the so-called hard-to-abate sectors like heavy industry, maritime shipping. What progress are we making in these areas where electrifying doesn't seem to be the path that's available to us?
No, it's electricity will grow as part of the manufacturing industries as well. But there are, in some industrial processes we need heat, different kind of heat, so we need molecules. Then we need hydrogen. We do have hydrogen today; it's all gray, but we think we need much more. And if we're going to do it in a decarbonized way, we have to produce blue hydrogen from natural gas. Or once we get enough electrons from renewable sources of electricity, we can turn those into green hydrogen. But we should probably use the electrons first to decarbonize the power sector. So that it's moving, but again, it's a large sector. It's a sector that grows. It's very difficult to decarbonize existing manufacturing plants. So the decision to decarbonize often happens when you replace the old capital equipment, whether that's a furnace in a steel plant or a processing facility in cement. Shipping is also moving, and we have IMO, the International Maritime Organization, moving that as well. But you need to find some batteries electricity won't cut it in the international maritime industry. So we think it's going to be blue or green hydrogen in the form of ammonia or methanol, mainly in shipping. So, then you need to replace the old vessels, or at least the engines in the vessels. Maybe we have now double fuel vessels coming in that can run on different kinds of fuels. But it's a massive capital stock of ships around the world that then have to be replaced, right, or modernized. And all that takes time and costs money.
Well, wanted to thank you for spending time with us today. Really appreciate the insights in your energy perspectives for 2024, and you taking the time to share both what you're thinking in the short term and these longer term outlook scenarios with us. Before you go, though, I was hoping to ask you, when you take a step back and take all these factors that we've been discussing today into account, what do you think that the future of energy will look like? And what do we need to be doing now to make it one that's compatible with our climate goals?
The future of energy will be a world where we have much more energy services delivered to us as a global population relative to the amount of energy supply we put in, because it will be more efficient. We will use more sources of efficient energy and use less, relatively speaking, of both inefficient and more polluting sources of energy. So we're on our way there. What we need to be doing now is, I think that the main thing we need to do now to at least increase the likelihood of moving faster towards the climate ambition is that we have to become friends, basically. Geopolitical conflict between different large powers will slow down the process because we do not exchange technology. We don't trust each other. We don't use the resources that one country or one region has to solve this problem for ourselves. This is a globally massively challenging and collective problem that requires collectively smart solutions. And then we got to sit down and become friends. We've got to start trusting each other. And of course, that's difficult. That's how difficult this is.
Thanks again to Eirik Wærness, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Future of Energy. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets. Facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.